we doing this morning? Well, good. A question for you. This goes back to the very beginning, and so I'm kind of curious if any of you remember. Here's your little trivia question. Do you remember what Martin Luther, John Wesley, and Aurelius Augustine have in common? No? Each of them, as we talked about at the very beginning of this series last year, each of them had a profound encounter with God during their study of the book of Romans, the letter of Romans. In fact, you go back and you look at all three of them, and they cite their study of that letter of Romans as something that was a turning point in their lives. And so, that's one of the reasons we have referred to this letter all throughout the series. We're going to be winding up our series on Romans today, but we have referred to it as the letter that changed the world. And one of the questions now, last year, well, actually the year before, we did a video series that we studied through Romans, and we kind of did the video, but we also did some questions. And then one of the questions that was asked in the beginning, but it was also asked at the end, and I thought it was great. But the question was that if you were responsible, if Paul had given you the job of delivering this letter to the church at Rome, and along your way, you were stopped by the authorities, and they were to ask you what you were doing, what it was that you were delivering, why it was that this letter was so important, what would you say? What would your response be? If they were to add, or if they were to make a deal with you and say, you know what, if you leave the letter with us, we'll let you go. Otherwise, we're going to detain you. Would you be willing to leave the letter with them to keep your own freedom? And I think a lot of it depends on whether or not we know what's in it. And one of the problems is that I think for us, sometimes, I thought that was a great question, because I think sometimes we lose sight of what these letters were. To us, when we think of the book of Romans, we think of it exactly that. We think of the Bible as exactly that. A collection of writings that if you were to lose it, what do? You just go out tomorrow and you buy another copy and you replace what you had. That's how we see it. But see, there was a time, and what we got to understand, this was a single letter, an original letter that was delivered to a church. And if the letter would have been lost, it would have had a huge, tremendous impact on Christianity. And so I think we need to read it as such. But the question was, what is contained? If you're trying to say what is contained in this letter of Romans, Romans is, as we studied, it is the essence of the Bible. The essence of Romans is the essence of the Bible, and it is a systematic study. Paul does it, and I love it. It is a systematic study of the gospel. It is a systematic study of the Old Testament. We've said it many times. This is an Old Testament Bible study, and he links the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, brings them together where they fit hand in hand. And so, if Romans is the essence of the Bible, what is the essence of the Bible? The essence of the Bible is how God can get a sinful person into heaven and not compromise who and what he is. The essence of the Bible, the message of the Bible is how God can get you and me into heaven without compromising who and what he is. And I think that what's really cool about this is the way that Paul builds this case and summarizes all of it. I've said many times, I think that in a lot of ways, Paul is kind of like he looks like an attorney. He writes so much like an attorney, where he builds a case, he overcomes objections, he deals with misconceptions, he lays out, you got to keep in mind at this time, a lot of the phrases that we read in Romans today that we cite as Christian doctrine, those words had never been spoken in Christian church. They were brand new teachings and doctrines that were coming out. And so Paul did such an amazing job of building the case, of laying it out and explaining it in such a way that it made sense. And as we looked through, we had 5 doctrines, 5 theologies that he lays out. Each one builds upon the other. moving from the beginning to the end of it. Each one is built upon that foundation. If you are visiting today is your first time here, I'm sorry, we're not going to go back and do the whole thing again. Okay? If you're watching on Facebook and you're like, oh, just tuned in, I want to see it, not going to go back and do all of them again. But we have a YouTube channel. And you are more than welcome to go back, and any of the messages that are entitled "The Letter That Changed the World" are right in this, and they are I started to say numerical, but they're by date, chronological. That's the word I was looking for. Anyway, so that you can go back and look through those if you want to kind of study it, catch up on some of this. But we are going to cover what the 5 doctrines were and go through them. And so as we're doing it. You know, like I said, Paul really does a great job of, he builds one on another. I went back this week, and one of the things that I made time to do was just to sit down and to read. I got a little book that I printed out that it is Romans without any chapter or verse. It's just as a letter as it was written. And I sat down and I read through it a few times this week to really just kind of absorb all of it. And I came up really, and to me I kind of came up with 3 questions. And we're not necessarily going to address these 3 questions, but I think that they are questions that we need to, it kind of frames this whole message. And I think the one is, is what impact should these teachings, what we read in Romans, what impact should it have on our daily walk? Okay? What impact should it have on that? I think another one was, what impact should it have in the way that we talk to God? Okay, it should change things. What impact should it have on the way that we relate to others as well? And I think those are things that we kind of have to wrestle with. But as I was going through that, and we could take and have 3 topics and say, how does this impact? How is this going to change? What is this going to do? But what I really found is that it seems like each one of these doctrines that we have talked about relates to an attitude that we need to develop. And so, actually in your notes you will find that you've got the doctrines there, and you can write the attitude next to it as they kind of pop up. And so, because the fact is that as we read Romans, as we read the Bible and we study this, how can we not be changed? And how can we not let it impact us? How can we not let it affect, if we're truly going to look at it, if we're truly going to study it, we're truly going to try to apply it. And so what we're going to kind of do today is the whole thing. We've gotten into all the little bits of it from time to time. Today we're going to back up. We're going to look big picture. I want us to kind of climb up, and we're going to take the 30,000 foot view and try to look at this as a whole and look at the entire book. And I really think that there is no better passage really to start with, but honestly to anchor us in than what Paul wrote early on in the letter. And I've said it again, I think that they are probably the greatest words ever penned by a mortal man. It's Romans chapter 1 verses 16 and 17, and Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith, from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The goal of this letter, I really see it as being twofold. Number one, the goal of Romans is to show us that those words that we just read are true. That they are truth. It's the reason that Romans contains my favorite word so many times in the Bible, therefore. In fact, 20 times the word therefore is used in the book of Romans. But the entire letter is really a letter of therefores when you start to count in all the times that he says for this reason, because of, so that, for. Because he's building that case in the same way that this leads us to this. Because of this, therefore. We know this to be true, therefore. That's what he goes through all throughout it. And so the first thing is, this study of Romans is to convince us, to show us as he builds this case, that Romans chapter 1 verses 16 and 17 are true. That they are truth. The second purpose of this letter is to teach us how to apply those words in our lives. To teach us how to apply those words in our walk, in the way that we relate to everyone. And so, the question that we got to ask, how do they affect our daily walk? How should they change our focus as well? I think that is a huge one, because if this is the letter that changed the world, the thing I want you to address today, the question I want you to wrestle with, will it change yours? Maybe even more accurately, will you let it change yours? Will you let this letter change your life? Because the fact is that knowing this stuff will not change our lives. It's not going to. Just knowing these doctrines is not going to do it. It is when we find a way to apply it in our lives. But a lot of times when we think of application, I think that we think of things that we do. And what I would really like you to do is to come back as we look at these different doctrines and understand that even more so than what we do, it is the attitude that we have. And I think that there are 5 attitudes here that we really need to apply. The first one that we got into was the doctrine of condemnation, and that is the teaching that we are all guilty, that we're all condemned. We have probably, you've heard it maybe in jest before, the statement that, well, first step is to admit that you have a problem. No, the first step is to admit that you have a problem, that you are powerless over it, and that your life has become unmanageable because of it. Okay? And that's what Paul is telling us right here when he talks about condemnation, when he talks about the fact that we are guilty, is the fact that we all have a problem. It is called sin. Okay? It is called original sin. And the thing is that we are powerless over it. And as a result, it runs our lives. And so Paul says, first off, that we're all guilty. As such, we are condemned and we are destined to suffer under the wrath of God. And there's, I hate to tell you this, but there is nothing that you or I can do in our power to solve our sin problem. There is nothing that you or I can do in our power to ever earn or deserve the solution to our sin problem. Okay? And we need to come to that point of realizing that. And I think that in a lot of ways, the problem, in many ways, one of the big problems of the church is we have made grace entirely too easy. That it is something that we come, and if we say a prayer, if we say some words, if we do some stuff, then we're saved. You know what? It's not what we do. It is what He already did. We are powerless to save ourselves. We are powerless. We have no ability to earn it. There is nothing we can do that will ever make us deserving of it. We are guilty. We are condemned on our own. And the thing is that right there, that should create an attitude in us of humility. I've heard it said many times, you've probably heard this as well. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. A lot of times we think that if you're going to be humble, you've got to beat yourself up. That you got to think that you're nothing. That you got to think that you're low. No, that is not what humility is. That's false humility. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. And that is the fact that when it comes to, because what this attitude of humility does when we're talking about the doctrine of condemnation is the fact that it goes counterintuitive to what the world teaches us. What does the world tell us? The world says you are the captain of your fate. You are the one that determines your destiny. You are the one that picks your direction. And what we find is that when we look at the Bible and we find that we are all guilty, that we are all condemned, that our default destination is to suffer under the wrath of God for all of eternity, it creates in us a humility. And a humility says, I'm not the captain of my own soul. I am not the commander of my own fate. I got to rely on Him. That's why the Bible tells us time and time again that God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. That when we try to save ourselves, when we live in that attitude of pride and ego, that God opposes us. But He gives grace to those that are humble. And the attitude, the doctrine of condemnation, the first thing is that we should learn to have an attitude of humility. One of my favorite verses is John 3:30. John the Baptist, when he says, He must become greater, I must become less. In other words, it's getting up every morning and saying, you know what, less of me and more of him. Less of me and more of him. That's what humility is. Humility is grasping the fact that the answer is not things we do. The answer is not church attendance. The answer is none of those things. The answer is in the gospel. Plain and simple, because it's not what we do. It is what he did. The answer is that salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to men by which we must be saved. The answer is in the gospel and the fact that we are saved by grace through faith, and that it's not about us. Okay? It is a gift of God. It has nothing to do with works. So not a single one of us can boast about what we have done to save ourselves. That is an attitude of humility and humbling ourselves before God. You know, Paul says, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel in that verse where why is Paul not ashamed of the gospel? Because Paul recognized the power of the gospel. And when he looked at it and recognized what it was and the power behind it and what was contained within it, there was no way to be ashamed of that. That was because Paul humbled himself. And if you want this letter to change your life, that's the first step, is to humble yourself before the Lord. To humble yourself before him. But, you know, and one of the things we also talked about is that, you know, we are condemned. Why? We're condemned because of our sin. But first and foremost, original sin says that we are condemned by the disobedience of who? Adam. Adam disobeyed in the Garden of Eden, and so we are guilty because of that. And I know that a lot of times we say, that's not fair. It's just not fair. But I think what we've realized as we've gone through this, and whether you want to admit it or not today, even without Adam's sin, we're all guilty enough on our own, aren't we? Yeah. But see, here's the good news about the supposed unfairness of being held accountable for Adam's sin, is because if we are guilty, condemned, and held accountable for Adam's disobedience in the garden, then that means that we can be justified freely through Jesus' obedience on the cross of Calvary. It means that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. We may have been guilty because of Adam, but we can be justified because of Jesus. And that was the second of the doctrines that we learned, is the doctrine of justification. If we are all guilty, the next doctrine is of justification, and that we are justified. And this is where Paul, when he says he's not ashamed of the gospel, why? Because in the gospel a righteousness is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith. From first to last. Okay? But what is that righteousness that is revealed? What is it that he's not ashamed of? Okay? And we have talked about this. We've said it many times. The righteousness that is revealed in the gospel is the righteousness that God's righteousness requires that he require. Okay? And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but think about it for just a moment. And we're talking about justification and the grace that comes by faith. I want you to imagine for a moment what happened if you were to die today. You die today and you find yourself tonight standing before God at the gates of heaven. And as you stand there in your filthy rags, as you stand there in all of the sin of your 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, 90 years of life, for God to look at you and say, why should I allow you into my heaven? There is no good answer, is there? There's no answer. The only answer that is possible is to say, because of Jesus. Because I have placed my faith in the gospel. I have placed my faith in the gospel that you have declared as your power for my salvation. Because in that gospel, there is a righteousness, the righteousness that your righteousness requires that you require in order for me to enter into heaven. and you not compromise who and what you are. But even as I say those words, and I've written them, and I've said them, and every time that I do, I'll be honest, it doesn't feel like enough if I'm not just laying face down in gratitude and thankfulness for what he did. The doctrine of justification should lead us to an attitude of thankfulness and of gratitude. Do you understand what has been done on your behalf? God has taken every bit of your sin and every bit of your ugliness and he put it on Jesus. He has taken Jesus' righteousness and he has put it on you. Not because of what you did, but because of what Jesus did. You know, imagine for a second that you're standing before a judge. You stand before a judge. The judge is known, if we think about this in a human term, this judge is known for being just, for being fair, for sticking to the letter and the intent of the law. You are guilty of all kinds of crimes, and you stand before him waiting for sentencing. What do you expect to happen? If the judge is just and is fair and all, he's going to throw the book at you, isn't he? You're guilty. That's what you deserve. Now, mercy, that's what justice is. Mercy, though, is when he gives you a plea deal, when he gives you a lesser sentence, when he says, because of good behavior, because it is a first time, whatever, I'm going to let you do this instead of that. That's what mercy is, not giving us what we deserve. But imagine if the judge were to look at you and say, you know what, you are guilty, but you're not going to accept the punishment because I'm going to pay that on your behalf. I'm going to accept your punishment. And not only am I going to pardon you, I'm not going to give you parole, I'm not going to give you probation. No, I am going to declare you innocent. There is no record whatsoever of all of the crimes that you did. It is just as if you had never committed them. Because that is what God did for us. That is what Jesus did for us. It is just as if I never sinned. It is the same for you. It's just as if you never committed. That's what grace is. And how can you consider that from, what would, if you were to find yourself, that's too easy. I can ignore a lot of things. That way I don't know. How could a single one of us sit there and have a judge make that declaration and not be overwhelmed with gratitude and thankfulness? See, we're not talking about eternity. We're talking about temporary time. That's what God has done for us. The doctrine of condemnation should lead us to an attitude of humility. The doctrine of justification should just overwhelm us with gratitude and thankfulness. And that then should foster in us as we move to the doctrine of sanctification. It should lead us into another attitude, which I see as a yearning. And I know we don't think of yearning as an attitude. We think of it more as an action, as an emotion. But consider it this way: if justification is a once for all time change in our relationship with God, we know that sanctification is an everyday, for the rest of our lifetime, change in our relationship with sin. And what I mean is that the doctrine of sanctification should create in us, we should have a yearning, a burning desire to be more like Christ. And a lot of times we think of that, we talk about being like Jesus, we talk about sanctification, we talk about growing in our faith, and so many times we see it as a chore. That we got to quit doing this, or we got to be more like that, that we got to do these things. No, the fact is that when we understand how guilty we were, when we understand what Jesus did to declare us innocent, justified, then sanctification, that doctrine, that should just create a yearning and a desire in us to be more like Jesus in everything that we do. It should create a yearning in us to love our wife, to love our husband, to love our kids the way that Jesus loved us. It should create a yearning within us to forgive others the same way that Jesus forgives us. It should create a yearning and a desire in us to be a servant, just as Jesus was a servant. That's what sanctification is. It's not fitting into this rigid, conservative mold that, don't smoke, don't cuss, don't chew, don't date girls that do. Don't do any of that stuff, and that means I'm a Christian. No, that's not. It's not about, this checklist that we tend to get into. It is getting up every morning with that desire to be more like Him. Instead of wearing a WWJD bracelet on our wrist, we ought to have it attached to our heart. That everything we do is wondering, how would Jesus respond? If I want to be like Him, how am I going to respond in this situation? How would Jesus handle this? How would He forgive this? How would He respond to that? Because that's what I want to be like. That's what it is. That's that yearning. And if you want to if you really do want to let this letter of Romans change your world, I really think the first thing that you need to do is you need to spend some time writing down some, I don't know whether you want to call it goals, whatever you want to call it. You guys know I had knee surgery, and so they put me in therapy. And therapy is not always fun. Anybody been through it? You know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not always fun. It's not always easy. Many times it is painful. I don't always want to do it. But you know what keeps me going? Before I ever sat down and started it, the therapist went through and said, what are your goals at this point? What are your goals at this point? Where do you want to be at this point? And so I have goals that are laid out. And as a result, and those times when I get down on the floor and I'm rolling the ball around and it hurts and I really don't want to do it anymore, if I remember where I want to be, I remember the goals I want to fulfill, and it makes it where I can push through that. No, growing up to be more like Christ is not going to be easy, because it's going to call us to make a lot of decisions that are not popular, that are not always easy, that sometimes are painful. But when we understand the goal, and when we know what we're looking towards, that gives us the strength and the ability to push through the painful and the difficult things, because we know what we're trying to get to. And so, yes, condemnation should create in us an attitude of humility. Justification creates in us an attitude of gratitude and thankfulness. And the doctrine of sanctification should create in us that if you take those two together, how can you have anything but a yearning, burning desire to be more like the one who paid that price for you? The fourth one then leads to the doctrine of vindication. And these, this is kind of a weird one, because these are 3 chapters that deal with God as it relates to the Jews. And to the people of Israel. But there is a huge message for us as well. And Paul really kind of summed it up, and there was a great passage that he took, and there was another one that I got here. And he says, he quoted Moses, and God told Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. I found myself in Proverbs 9:10 that said, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that is the attitude. Fear of the Lord. And I know that you probably think, fear of the Lord, that's not an attitude. That's like, no, it's run away. No. Now, really, to me, fear of the Lord from this standpoint, it's not about running away. It's not about being scared. It is an attitude that is based upon the sovereignty of God. It is an attitude that is born out of the fact that we realize and we understand that God is large and in charge. That there is no one that's going to push him around, that there's no way that we're going to paint him into a corner, that God is. He's going to show mercy to those on whom he will have mercy, and he will show compassion to those on whom he will have compassion. That is why the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, because reverence and submission and surrender to the Lord in his sovereignty, understanding that he is who he is, is the beginning of everything that is wisdom. And so that attitude of the fear of the Lord is what drives us to say, you know what? I don't always know what this is going to be. I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I know who holds the future. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but I know that He has promised me that if I trust Him, that it will turn out for good. Maybe not a good thing right now, but it will turn out for my good. That He's always working for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. Which leads us into the final doctrine that he lays out, and that is application. Once again, this is something I think we think of many times as an action. You know, application is an action. How are we going to apply this? How are we going to do this? What are we going to say in this situation? Application, and it's funny, you know, we had four doctrines, and if you take and you kind of the culmination of all of those leads you to application, to the final doctrine. In the same way, though, as we look at these four attitudes, the culmination and the kind of fulfillment of all of them is an attitude of worship. That's what application is. Application of God's Word, to take and apply what we have learned. Condemnation, justification, sanctification, vindication leads to application. Well, you know what? Humility. True humility, which leads to gratitude and thankfulness, which then leads us into the fact that yearning to be like Christ, an understanding that God is sovereign, the fear of the Lord, that leads us to worship. We understand who He is. And that's why Paul in Romans 12:1, he says that, therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to the Lord. This is your spiritual act of worship. That's what application is. When we apply God's Word in our lives, that is worship. We tend to think of worship as what? It's a song, it's raising our hands, it's closing our eyes, it's what that's what we think of as, oh, I'm going to worship. No, worship is taking God's Word and applying it in our lives. Which means that in order to truly worship the Lord, what do we have to do? We got to humble ourselves before the Lord. We have got to give thanks and gratitude for all that He has done for us. We have to have a yearning. Worship is trying to be more like Christ every single day. Worship is understanding that we don't know how things are going to turn out, but we know that God is sovereign and that God is going to bring it about. And it's putting our will aside and trusting His will. It is putting our purposes aside and trusting His purposes. That is what it means to worship. That's what it means to surrender. That's what it means to apply this to our lives. And I've said many times that our attitude do you believe that our beliefs should drive our actions? Do you believe that your actions should be the result of what you believe? Here's the question of the hour. What do your actions say you believe? If you were to look at your actions, if you were to look at the way that you apply what you believe, what would it say? Would it say that you believe in the doctrine of condemnation of guilt? Would it show an attitude of humility before God? Would it be a reflection of gratitude and thankfulness, knowing that God did for me what I could never do for myself? Would it show and reflect an attitude of a burning desire in everything I do to be more like Jesus, to follow after Him, to love my wife the way that He loves me, to forgive my kids the way that He forgives me, to walk, to talk, to serve, everything that I do to be like Him? Would that be the reflection? Is that what our actions would show? Would it show that we trust that God is sovereign? Would it show that we have taken and our life is just one long act of worship, day in and day out, getting up every day and saying, God, you know what? Today is the day that you have made. Guide my steps. Lead my path. I am going to bring glory to you in everything that I do. I want out of the spotlight. I want everything I do to point to you. I don't want people to look at me. I want them to look at you. Is that what your actions would show? Because that's the question we have to ask. And I think the big question is, as we read this letter, we know that it has the power to change the world. The question is, will it change your world? Will you let it change your world? Will you let it in? Plain and simple. I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to have our time of decision, and that really... You don't have to come walking down here to make a decision. You can step into one of our prayer rooms, one of our elders, and they would love to pray with you, to pray for you, whether you say anything. Does not matter. But you don't even have to do that. If you're here today and you realize that there are parts of your life that they do not reflect that you have surrendered everything to God, if you realize that there are areas of your life that need to change, if you realize that there are ways in which you have read these biblical accounts, you've read these theologies and these doctrines, but you've never turned them into an attitude, and you want to change that today, then I would tell you, you can do that standing right where you are. That is closing your eyes. And in our time of prayer, as the song is being sung, we're sitting here and sing Ocean, stepping out in faith. That is just asking God in a quiet way to say, Lord, make today the day. Change it today. Give me in my heart a desire to be humble. Give me that attitude of worship. Give me a desire to be like you. Change that in me right now. If you have a decision to make, please don't wait. Make it today.